2251. Death of Tar-Atanamir. Tar-Atanamir takes the sceptre. Rebellion and division of the Númenorians begins. About this time, the Nazgûl or ringwraiths, slaves of the Nine Rings, first appear. Kings and Queens of Númenor the 14th. Tar-Atanamir. Born 1986 of the Second Age, died 2386 of the Second Age at age 400. Ruled 2221 to 2386 of the Second Age for 165 years. Then Tar-Atanamir, son of Atanamir, became king, and he was of like mind, and in his day the people of Númenor became divided. On the one hand was the greater party, and they were called the King's Men, and they grew proud and were estranged from the Eldar and the Valar. And on the other hand was the lesser party, and they were called the Elendili, the Elf-friends, for though they remained loyal indeed to the king and the house of Elros, they wished to keep the friendship of the Eldar, and they hearkened to the counsel of the lords of the West. Nonetheless, even they, who named themselves the Faithful, did not wholly escape from the affliction of their people, and they were troubled by the thought of death. Thus the bliss of Westernesse became diminished, but still its might and splendor increased. For the kings and their people had not abandoned wisdom, and if they loved the Valar no longer, at least they still feared them. They did not dare openly to break the ban or to sail beyond the limits that had been appointed. Eastward still they steered their tall ships, but the fear of death grew ever darker upon them, and they delayed it by all means that they could, and they began to build great houses for their dead, while their wise men labored unceasingly to discover if they might the secret of recalling life, or at the least of the prolonging of men's days. Yet they achieved only the art of preserving incorrupt the dead flesh of men, and they filled all the land with silent tombs in which the thought of death was enshrined in the darkness. And some taught that there was a land of shades filled with the race of the things that they had known and loved upon the mortal earth, and that in shadow the dead should come there bearing with them the shadows of their possessions. But those that lived turned the more eagerly to pleasure and revelry, desiring ever more goods and more riches, and after the days of Tar-Atanamir, the offerings of the first fruits to Eru was neglected, and men went seldom any more to the hollow upon the heights of Meneltarma in the midst of the land. Many of the king's men began to forsake the use of the elven tongues, and to teach them no longer to their children. But the royal titles were still given in Quenya out of ancient custom rather than love, for fear lest the breaking of the old usage should bring ill fortune. Sauron gathered into his hands all the remaining rings of power, and he dealt them out to the other peoples of Middle-earth, hoping thus to bring under his sway all those that desired secret power beyond the measure of their kind. 7 rings he gave to the dwarves, but to men he gave 9, for men proved in this matter as in others the readiest to his will. In his letter to Milton Waldman, Tolkien would write, "All through the twilight of the Second Age, the shadow is growing in the east of Middle-earth, spreading its sway more and more over men, who multiply as the elves begin to fade. And all those rings that he governed, he perverted, the more easily since he had a part in their making, and they were accursed, and they betrayed in the end all those that used them. Dwarfs indeed proved tough and hard to tame. They ill endure the domination of others, and the thoughts of their hearts are hard to fathom, nor can they be turned to shadows. They use their rings only for the getting of wealth, but wrath and an overmastering greed of gold were kindled in their hearts, of which evil enough after came to the prophet of Sauron." It is said that the foundation of each of the 7 hordes of the dwarf kings of old was a golden ring, but all those hordes long ago were plundered, and the dragons devoured them, and of the 7 rings some were consumed in fire, and some Sauron recovered. Men proved easier to ensnare. Those who used the 9 rings became mighty in their day, kings, sorcerers, and warriors of old. They obtained glory and great wealth, yet it turned to their undoing. They had, as it seemed, unending life, yet life became unendurable to them. They could walk, if they would, unseen by all eyes in this world, beneath the sun, and they could see things in worlds invisible to mortal men. But too often they beheld only the phantoms and delusions of Sauron, and one by one, sooner or later, according to their native strength and to the good or evil of their wills in the beginning, they fell under the thraldom of the ring that they bore and under the domination of the One, which was Sauron's. And they became forever invisible save to him that wore the ruling ring, and they entered into the realm of shadows. The Nazgûl were they, the ring race, the enemy's most terrible servants. Darkness went with them, and they cried with the voices of death. Yet Sauron was ever guileful, and it is said that among those whom he ensnared with the 9 rings, 3 were great lords of Númenorian race. In the Fellowship of the Ring, Tolkien creates a vivid image of the Nazgûl as, centuries later in the Third Age, they appear to Frodo when wearing the One Ring. So black were they that they seemed like black holes in the deep shade behind them. He thought that he heard a faint hiss as of venomous breath and felt a thin, piercing chill. Though everything else remained as before, dim and dark, the shapes became terribly clear. He was able to see beneath their black wrappings. In their white faces burned keen and merciless eyes. Under their mantles were long gray robes. Upon their gray hairs were helms of silver. In their haggard hands were swords of steel. Their eyes fell on him and pierced him as they rushed towards him. Later in the Two Towers, the author has Faramir speak of the Nazgûl's origins. It is said that their lords were men of Númenor who had fallen into dark wickedness. To them, the enemy had given rings of power, and he had devoured them. Living ghosts they were become, terrible and evil. 2280. Umbar is made into a great fortress of Númenor. 2350. Pelargir is built. It becomes the chief haven of the faithful Númenorians. Thus, it came to pass in that time that the Númenorians first made great settlements upon the west shores of the ancient lands, for their own lands seemed to them shrunken, and they had no rest or content therein, and they desired now wealth and dominion in Middle-earth, since the west was denied. Great harbors and strong towers they made, and there many of them took up their abode, but they appeared now rather as lords and masters and gatherers of tribute than as helpers and teachers. And the great ships of the Númenorians were borne east on the winds, and returned ever laden, and the power and majesty of their kings were increased, and they drank, and they feasted, and they clad themselves in silver and gold. In all this the Elf-friends had small part. They alone came now ever to the north and the land of Gil-galad, keeping their friendship with the elves, and lending them aid against Sauron. But the king's men sailed far away to the south, and though the kingdoms and strongholds they made have left many rumors in the legends of men, the Eldar know naught of them. Only Pelargir they remember, for there was the haven of the Elf-friends above the mouths of Anduin the Great. The Númenorians who had first gone to Middle-earth, seeking wealth and dominion, were driven to build fortifications and defenses on its coastal regions as a result of Sauron's relentless ambition and the coming of the Ulari, as the Nazgûl are named in Quenya. And when the Ulari arose, that were the ring race, Sauron's servants, and the strength of his terror and mastery over men had grown exceedingly great, he began to assail the strong places of the Númenorians upon the shores of the sea. The Elf-friends go chiefly to the northwest, but their strongest place is at Pelargir above the mouths of Anduin. The king's folk established lordships in Umbar and Harad and in many other places on the coast of the Great Lands. During the same time, Sauron extends his dominion slowly over the great part of Middle-earth, but his power reaches out eastward, since he is withheld from the coast by the Númenorians. In successive years, the divisions were to deepen between Númenorians known as the king's folk, or the king's men, and those who were Elf-friends and who retained an unswerving loyalty to the Eldar. The kings and their followers little by little abandoned the use of the Eldarin tongues, and at last the 20th king took his royal name in Númenorian form, calling himself Ar-Adûnakhôr, Lord of the West. This seemed ill-omened to the faithful, for hitherto they had given that title only to one of the Valar or to the Elder King himself. Now Sauron's lust and pride increased until he knew no bounds, and he determined to make himself master of all things in Middle-earth, and to destroy the elves, and to compass, if he might, the downfall of Númenor. He brooked no freedom, nor any rivalry, and he named himself Lord of the Earth, a mask he still could wear, so that if he wished, he might deceive the eyes of men, seeming to them wise and fair. But he ruled rather by force and fear, if they might avail, and those who perceived his shadow spreading over the world called him the Dark Lord, and named him the Enemy, and he gathered again under his government all the evil things of the days of Morgoth that remained on earth or beneath it, and the orcs were at his command and multiplied like flies. Thus the black years began, which the elves call the days of flight. In that time many of the elves of Middle-earth fled to Lindon, and thence over the seas never to return, and many were destroyed by Sauron and his servants. But in Lindon Gil-galad still maintained his power, and Sauron dared not as yet to pass the mountains of Ered Luin nor to assail the havens, and Gil-galad was aided by the Númenorians. Elsewhere Sauron reigned, and those who would be free took refuge in the fastnesses of wood and mountain, and ever fear pursued them. In the east and south, well nigh all men were under his dominion, and they grew strong in those days and built many towns and walls of stone, and they were numerous and fierce in war and armed with iron. To them Sauron was both king and god, and they feared him exceedingly, for he surrounded his abode with fire. 2386. Kings and Queens of Númenor the 15th. Tar-Palantir, born 2136 of the Second Age, died 2526 of the Second Age at age 390. Rule 2386 to 2526 of the Second Age for 140 years. Hereafter the kings ruled in name, from the death of their father to their own death, though the actual power passed often to their sons of counselors, and the days of the descendants of Elros waned under their shadow. The 15th ruler of Númenor is said to have been called Talamidi, silver-handed, because of his love of silver, and he bade his servants to seek ever for mithril. 2526. Kings and Queens of Númenor the 16th. Tar-Palantir, born 2277 of the Second Age, died 2637 of the Second Age at age 360. Ruled 2526 to 2637 of the Second Age for 111 years. Tar-Palantir was the third ruling queen. She gave little heed to ruling, loving rather music and dance, and the power was wielded by her husband, Ar-Adûnakhôr, younger than she, but a descendant of the same degree from Tar-Atanamir. 2637. Kings and Queens of Númenor, usurper, Tar-Atanamir, Ar-Adûnakhôr, born 2286 of the Second Age, died 2657 of the Second Age at age 371. Rule illegalment 2637 to 2657 of the Second Age for 20 years. Ar-Adûnakhôr took the sceptre upon his wife's death, calling himself Tar-Atanamir and withholding the rule from his son Alcarin, yet some do not reckon him in the line of kings as 17th and pass to Alcarin. 2657. Kings and Queens of Númenor the 17th. Tar-Alcarin, born 2406 of the Second Age, died 2737 of the Second Age at age 331. Ruled de jure 2637 to 2737 of the Second Age for 100 years. De facto from 2657 to 2737 of the Second Age for 80 years. Due to the usurpation by his father, Ar-Adûnakhôr, the so-called Tar-Atanamir, Tar-Alcarin only ruled as king for 80 years. 2737. Kings and Queens of Númenor the 18th. Tar-Palantir, Ar-Pharazôn Born 2516 of the Second Age, died 2825 of the Second Age at age 309. Ruled 2737 to 2825 of the Second Age for 88 years. He took the name Tar-Palantir, for in his youth he was a great captain and won wide lands along the coast of Middle-earth. Thus he kindled the hate of Sauron, who nonetheless withdrew and built his power in the east, far from the shores, biding his time. In the days of Tar-Palantir, the name of the king was first spoken in Ar-Adûnakhôr, and by the king's men he was called Ar-Pharazôn. 2825. Kings and Queens of Númenor the 19th. Tar-Atanamir, Ar-Adûnakhôr. Born 2618 of the Second Age, died 2899 of the Second Age at age 281. Ruled 2825 to 2899 of the Second Age for 74 years. Tar-Atanamir was the last of the Númenorian kings to take the sceptre, using a Quenya-style royal name. 2899. Ar-Adûnakhôr takes the scepter. 2899. Kings and Queens of Númenor the 20th. Ar-Adûnakhôr, Tar-Palantir. Born 2709 of the Second Age, died 2962 of the Second Age at age 253. Ruled 2899 to 2962 of the Second Age for 63 years. In those days, the shadow grew deeper upon Númenor, and the lives of the kings of the house of Elros waned because of their rebellion, but they hardened their hearts the more against the Valar. And the 20th king took the scepter of his fathers, and he ascended the throne in the name of Adûnakhôr, Lord of the West, forsaking the elven tongues and forbidding their use in his hearing. Yet in the scroll of kings the name Herunumen was inscribed in the high elven speech because of ancient custom which the kings feared to break utterly lest evil befall. Now this title seemed to the faithful overproud, being the title of the Valar, and their hearts were sorely tried between their loyalty to the house of Elros and the reverence of the appointed powers. But worse was yet to come. In this reign, the elven tongues were no longer used, nor permitted to be taught, but were maintained in secret by the faithful, and the ships from Ar-Sea came seldom and secretly to the west shores of Númenor thereafter. And indeed, Ar-Adûnakhôr began to persecute the faithful and punish those who used the elven tongues openly, and the Eldar came no more to Númenor. The power and wealth of the Númenorians nonetheless continued to increase, but their years lessened as their fear of death grew and their joy departed. 2962. Kings and Queens of Númenor the 21st. Ar-Simrathon, Tar-Palantir. Born 2798 of the Second Age, died 3033 of the Second Age at age 235. Ruled 2962 to 3033 of the Second Age for 71 years. 3033. Kings and Queens of Númenor the 22nd. Ar-Adûnakhôr, Tar-Palantir. Born 2876 of the Second Age, died 3102 of the Second Age at age 226. Ruled 3033 to 3102 of the Second Age for 69 years. 3102. Kings and Queens of Númenor the 23rd. Ar-Gimmelzor, Tar-Palantir. Born 2960 of the Second Age, died 3175 of the Second Age at age 215. Ruled 3102 to 3175 of the Second Age for 73 years. Ar-Gimmelzor, the 23rd king, was the greatest enemy of the faithful that had yet arisen. In his day, the white tree was untended and began to decline, and he forbade utterly the use of the elven tongues, and punished those that welcomed the ships of Ar-Sea that still came secretly to the west shores of the land. He revered nothing and went never to the hollow of Eru. Now the Elendili, the faithful, dwelt mostly in the western regions of Númenor. But Ar-Gimmelzor commanded all that he could discover to be of this party to remove from the west and dwell in the east of the land, and there they were watched. And the chief dwelling of the faithful in the later days was thus nigh to the harbor of Númenor. Thence many set sail to Middle-earth, seeking the northern coast, where they might speak still with the Eldar in the kingdom of Gil-galad. This was known to the kings, but they hindered it not, so long as the Elendili departed from their land and did not return, for they desired to end all friendship between the people and the Eldar of Erisea, whom they named the spies of the Valar, hoping to keep their deeds and their counsels hidden from the lords of the west. But all that they did was known to Manwë, and the Valar were wroth with the kings of Númenor, and gave them counsel and protection no more, and the ships of Erisea came never again out of the sunset, and the havens of Andúnié were forlorn. Highest in honor after the house of the kings were the lords of Andúnié, for they were of the line of Elros, being descended from Cimmerian, daughter of Tar-Elendil, the fourth king of Númenor. And these lords were loyal to the kings and revered them, and the lord of Andúnié was ever among the chief counselors of the sceptre. Yet also from the beginning they bore a special love to the Eldar and reverence for the Valar, and as the shadow grew they aided the faithful as they could. But for long they did not declare themselves openly, and sought rather to amend the hearts of the lords of the sceptre with wiser counsels. There was a lady, Inzilbeth, renowned for her beauty, and her mother was Lindorie, sister of Arendor, the lord of Andúnié in the days of Ar-Sakhalthor, father of Ar-Gimmelzor. Gimmelzor took her to wife, though this was little to her liking, for she was in heart one of the faithful, being taught by her mother, but the kings and their sons were grown proud and not to be gainsaid in their wishes. No love was there between Ar-Gimmelzor and his queen, or between their sons. Inziladun, the elder, was like his mother in mind as in body, but Gimmelkad, the younger, went with his father, unless he were yet prouder and more willful. To him Ar-Gimmelzor would have yielded the scepter rather than to the elder son, if the laws had allowed. 3175. Repentance of Tar-Palantir, civil war in Númenor. Kings and queens of Númenor the 24th. Tar-Palantir, Ar-Inziladun. Born 3035 of the Second Age, died 3255 of the Second Age at age 220. Ruled 3175 to 3255 of the Second Age for 80 years. When Inziladun acceded to the scepter, he took again a title in the Elven tongue as of old, calling himself Tar-Palantir, for he was far-sighted both in eye and in mind, and even those that hated him feared his words as those of a true seer. Tar-Palantir repented of the ways of the kings before him, and would fain have returned to the friendship of the Eldar and the lords of the west. He gave peace for a while to the faithful, and he went once more at due seasons to the hollow of Eru upon the Meneltarma, which Ar-Gimmelzor had forsaken. The white tree he tended again with honor, and he prophesied, saying that when the tree perished, then also would the line of the kings come to its end. But his repentance was too late to appease the anger of the Valar with the insolence of his fathers, of which the greater part of his people did not repent. And Gimmelkad, the king's brother, was strong and ungentle, and following the ways of Ar-Gimmelzor, he took the leadership of those that had been called the king's men, and opposed the will of his brother as openly as he dared, and yet more in secret. Thus the days of Tar-Palantir became darkened with grief, and he would spend much of his time in the west, and there ascended often the ancient tower of King Minister upon the hill of Ormet-Nai to Andúnié, whence he gazed westward in yearning, hoping to see maybe some sail upon the sea. But no ship came ever again from the west to Númenor, and Avalone was veiled in cloud. He also would spend much of his days in Andúnié, since Lindorie, his mother's mother, was of the kin of the lords, being sister instead of Earendr, 15th Lord and grandfather of Númenor, who was Lord of Andúnie in the days of Tar-Palantir his son. Tar-Palantir's brother, Gimilcad, died 2 years before his 200th year, which was accounted an early death for one of Elroc's line even in its waning. But this brought no peace to the king. For Ar-Pharazôn, son of Gimilcad and nephew to the king, had become a man yet more restless and eager for wealth and power than his father. Ar-Pharazôn was a man of great beauty and strength, stature after the image of the first kings. Indeed, in his youth, was not unlike the Edain of old in mind. Also, though he had courage and strength of will rather than of wisdom, as after appeared, when he was corrupted by the counsels of his father and the acclaim of the people. In his earlier days, he had a close friendship with Amandir, who was afterwards Lord of Andúnie, and he had loved the people of the house of Valindir, with whom he had kinship, though Insilbeth, his father's mother. With them he was often a guest. And there came Zimrifel, named Miriel in the elven tongue, cousin, daughter of Insiladun, who was later King Tar-Palantir. Now Zimrifel was a woman of great beauty, smaller in stature than were most women of that land, with bright eyes. She was older than Pharazôn by 1 year, but seemed younger. Elantir, the brother of Amandir, loved Miriel, but when first she saw Pharazôn, in the splendor of his young manhood, and when Pharazôn was greeted upon the steps of the house, her eyes and her heart were turned to him for his beauty and for his wealth also. And Pharazôn went away, and Miriel remained unwed. Pharazôn had fared often abroad, as a leader in the wars that the Númenorians made then in the coastlands of Middle-earth, seeking to extend their dominion over men, and thus he had won great renown as a captain both by land and by sea. Therefore, when he came back to Númenor, hearing of his father's death, the hearts of the people were turned to him, for he brought with him great wealth, and was for the time free in his giving. And it came to pass that Tar-Palantir grew weary of grief and died. He had married late and had no son, but a daughter only born in the year 3117, whom he named Miriel in the elven tongue, and to her now by right in the laws of the Númenorians came the sceptre. But Pharazôn took her to wife against her will, doing evil in this and evil also in that the laws of Númenor did not permit the marriage, even in the royal house, of those more nearly akin than cousins in the second degree. And when they were wedded, he seized the sceptre into his own hand, taking the title of Ar-Pharazôn, Tar-Calion in the elven tongue, and the name of his queen he changed to Ar-Zimrifel. 3255. Ar-Pharazôn the Golden seizes the sceptre. Kings and queens of Númenor. Tar-Miriel, born 3117 of the Second Age, died in the downfall 3319 of the Second Age at age 202. Rule. Although rightfully 25th ruler of Númenor, she did not succeed her father due to her having surrendered the sceptre to Ar-Pharazôn. She would be queen regnant for the brief period in 3319 of the Second Age between Ar-Pharazôn embarking for his assault on Valinor and the final drowning of Númenor. 3255. Kings and Queens of Númenor the 25th. Ar-Pharazôn, Tar-Calion, born 3118 of the Second Age, died in the downfall 3319 of the Second Age at age 201. Rule by usurpation 3255 to 3319 of the Second Age for 64 years. The mightiest and proudest was Ar-Pharazôn, the golden of all those that wielded the sceptre of the Sea Kings since the foundation of Númenor, and 24 kings and queens had ruled the Númenorians before, and slept now in their deep tombs under the mount of Meneltarma, lying upon beds of gold. No less than the kingship of the world was his desire. The Elendili, Elfriends, the faithful alone, were not subservient to Ar-Pharazôn, or dared to speak against his wishes, and it became well known to all in that time that Amandir, the lord of Andúnie, was head of their party, though not openly declared. Therefore Ar-Pharazôn persecuted the faithful, stripping them of any wealth that they had, and he deprived the heirs of Valindir of their lordship. And Dunia he took then, and made it the chief harbor of the king's ships, and Amandil the Lord he commanded to dwell in Númenor. Yet he did not otherwise molest him, nor dismiss him yet from his counsel. For in the days of his youth, ere his father corrupted him, Amandil had been his dear friend, and Amandil was well beloved also by many who were not of the Elendili. Describing the change that had overtaken the Númenorians, JRR Tolkien wrote in the letter to Milton Waldman, penned in 1951. Númenor has grown in wealth, wisdom, and glory under its line of great kings of long life, directly descended from Elros, Eärendil's son, brother of Elrond. The downfall of Númenor, the second fall of man, or man rehabilitated but still mortal, brings on a catastrophic end not only of the Second Age, but of the old world, the primeval world of legend, envisaged as flat and bounded. After which the Third Age began, the Twilight Age, or Medium Aeon, the first of the broken and changed world, the last of the lingering dominion of visible, fully incarnate elves, and the last also in which evil assumes a single dominant incarnate shape. The downfall that will follow is partly the result of an inner weakness in men, consequent, if you will, upon the first fall, unrecorded in those tales, repented but not fully healed. Reward on earth is more dangerous for men than punishment. The fall is achieved by the cunning of Sauron in exploiting this weakness. Its central theme is inevitably, I think, in a story of a ban or prohibition. The Númenorians dwell within far sight of the easternmost immortal land, Ersea, and as the only men to speak an elvish tongue learned in the days of their alliance, they are in constant communication with their ancient friends and allies, either in the bliss of Ersea or in the kingdom of Gil-galad on the shores of Middle-earth. They became, thus in appearance and even in powers of mind, hardly distinguishable from the elves, but they remained mortal, even though rewarded by a triple or more than a triple span of years. Their reward is their undoing, or the means of their temptation. Their long life aids their achievements in arts and wisdom, but breeds a possessive attitude to these things, and desire or waits for more time for their enjoyment. Foreseeing this in part, the gods laid a ban on the Númenorians from the beginning. They must never sail to Ersea nor westward out of sight of their own land. In all other directions they could go as they would. They must not set foot on immortal lands, and so become enamored with immortality within a world which was against their law, the special doom or gift of Ilúvatar, God, and which their nature could not in fact endure. There are three phases in their fall from grace. First, acquiescence, obedience that is free and willing, though without complete understanding. Then for long they obey unwillingly, murmuring more and more openly. Finally they rebel, and a rift appears between the king's men and rebels and the small minority of persecuted faithful. In the first stage, being men of peace, their courage is devoted to sea voyages. As descendants of Eärendil, they became the supreme mariners, and being barred from the west, they sailed to the uttermost north and south and east. Mostly, they come to the west shores of Middle-earth, where they aid the elves and men against Sauron and incur his undying hatred. In those days, they would come amongst wild men as almost divine benefactors, bringing gifts of arts and knowledge and passing away again, leaving many legends behind of kings and gods out of the sunset. In the second stage, the days of pride and glory and grudging of the ban, they begin to seek wealth rather than bliss. The desire to escape death produced a cult of the dead, and they lavished wealth in entombs and memorials. They now made settlements on the west shores, but these became rather strongholds and factories of lords seeking wealth, and the Númenorians became tax gatherers, carrying off over the sea ever more and more goods in their great ships. The Númenorians began the forging of arms and engines. This phase ended, and the last began with the ascent of the throne by the 25th king of the line of Elros, Tar-Palantir the Golden, Ar-Pharazôn, the most powerful and proud of all kings.